Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to fundamentally shift how you evaluate economic policies and business decisions. We're diving right into the profound difference between the seen and the unseen, drawing on some of the most influential economic and business writings of the past century. So, let's just kick things off with a slightly uncomfortable question. Why do brilliant, top-tier executives celebrate decisions that slowly destroy their own companies? I know it sounds totally contradictory, right? But it literally happens all the time. It's the illusion of short-term success completely masking long-term decay. Here's our map for today. 1. The one lesson. 2. The broken window fallacy. 3. The seen versus unseen. 4. Avoiding sunk cost traps. And 5. Executive strategic checklist. Okay, section 1, the one lesson. Henry Hazlitt's classic book, Economics in One Lesson, basically boils the entire study of economics down to a single sentence. He demands that we look past those immediate flashy bumps in a single metric to see the long-term impact on the whole community. When a leader focuses only on a quick win for their own department while totally ignoring the systemic decay of the wider organization, well, they're practicing terrible economics. True entrepreneurial excellence requires a much, much wider lens. Moving right along to section 2, the broken window fallacy. To really grasp why ignoring this long-term view is so disastrous, imagine this classic scenario detailed by Hazlitt. A hoodlum throws a heavy brick through a baker's window. Obviously, the baker is furious, right? Because now he's forced to spend $50 on repairs. But then a crowd gathers, and people start murmuring that, maybe this isn't such a bad thing after all. Maybe it's actually good for business. And this brilliantly illustrates the core problem. The crowd sees the glazier getting $50. They see a visible economic transaction and think, hey, destruction just stimulated the economy. But they completely miss what is invisible. They forget all about the tailor. See, the baker was planning to spend that exact $50 on a new suit that very afternoon. Because he had to fix the window, that suit will never be made. The glazier's gain is exactly the tailor's loss, and the community as a whole is now short one suit. They're poorer, not richer. People just tend to only see what's immediately visible to the eye. Which brings us to section 3, the seen versus unseen. Let's scale this fallacy up into corporate strategy and public policy. According to this theory, managing by the seen, like applauding government subsidies to save a stagnant industry, is argued to actually drain capital from the unseen. Theorists point out that this diverted capital could have funded highly efficient, innovative startups, or take make-work projects to boost employment. When some praise those, critics argue we don't see the private homes and cars that weren't built because that capital was expropriated. And when protectionist tariffs are used for local producers, it might look like a win locally, but the unseen reality is often higher input costs for domestic manufacturers and a loss of competitive export markets. This entire concept is absolutely central to the management framework discussed in Charles Koch's book, Good Profit. Koch argues that relying on the visible benefits of corporate welfare, like lobbying for special protections or subsidies, is just bad profit. He suggests it ultimately harms the broader economy and stifles true innovation. Good profit, on the flip side, requires true value creation. It's about creating superior products for customers while consuming fewer resources and always acting lawfully and with integrity. Because integrity isn't just a nice-to-have, it's the absolute baseline of long-term thinking. This perfectly captures the contrast we're looking at here. On one side, we have the ephemeral hype of someone like Elizabeth Holmes, a product propped up with tape and promises, taking in billions based on what turned out to be a massive fraud. That was entirely short-term, visible noise. But on the other side, we have true long-term delivery, like Steve Jobs' rocket ship innovations. Real entrepreneurs don't just generate hype, they deliver. The market ultimately corrects breaches of integrity, for sure. If you abandon ethics for short-term cash extraction, customers will eventually abandon you. All right, section 4, avoiding sunk cost traps. This brings us to another massive danger of short-term seen thinking, the sheer inability to admit a mistake. A classic failure here is falling into the sunk costs trap. This happens when leaders ignore future consequences simply to avoid the immediate, visible embarrassment of admitting a loss. Psychologically, it's incredibly difficult for a leader to stand up and say, the millions we just spent are gone and we have absolutely nothing to show for it. So instead of looking forward at the future value of an investment, they look backward at what they've already spent. They double down on a failure just to delay that painful, visible moment. Economist Thomas Sowell points out a perfect historical example of this, the supersonic Concorde jet. Early on, it became glaringly obvious that high fuel costs would make it totally impossible to recover the investment through passenger fares. Private plane manufacturers like Boeing absorbed their early losses and smartly dropped the idea. But the British and French governments, well, they had publicly committed to it. To avoid the immediate, visible political failure before an election, they just kept pumping money into a massive sunk cost trap. Economists like Sowell argue this highlights a pretty stark contrast. In a free market, they posit that the costs of mistakes become so painfully high so quickly that there's really no choice but to change course before bankruptcy hits. The day of reckoning arrives fast. Conversely, they argue that in a government bureaucracy, officials are often just incentivized to persuade voters until the next election, which makes it highly rational for them to hide mistakes rather than correct them immediately. We actually see this free market discipline in action with a decision made by Koch Industries. During the 2018 steel tariffs, rather than immediately passing those politically induced ephemeral price spikes onto their customers, they just absorbed the costs. They sacrificed a seen, short-term profit margin to secure an unseen, long-term customer loyalty. And it worked out. They gained market share while their competitors floundered in all that price volatility.
Let's wrap things up with Section 5, Executive Strategic Checklist.
Before you commit your capital or set a new policy, run your decisions through this 3-step checklist. First, the long-term test. Are you just chasing a quarterly win, or are you looking 10 years out? Second, the universal test. Does this decision benefit all stakeholders, or are you just seeking a special favor? And third, the all-important unseen test. By funding this highly visible, immediate project, what internal innovations are you preventing? To execute that checklist properly, you really have to build on these 3 cornerstones. You need good thinking, deep reasoning to find actual solutions. You need social cooperation, voluntary action to reach common goals. And above all, you need humility. It's the essential baseline. Without the humility to admit you don't know everything, you're never going to adapt to market realities. So I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to take back to your boardroom as you rethink your entire strategy. What unseen innovations are you destroying right now just to fund your visible, short-term successes? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.